I'm here with Ash Carter, who is the 25th U.S. Secretary of Defense under Barack Obama and the author of this new book, Inside the Five-Sided Box. So happy and honored to have you today, Ash.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So your first job was at a car wash and you got fired. Why did you get fired and what did you learn from that experience?
Car wash on North Broad Street in Philadelphia. I was 11 years old because you could get working papers at that age. And there was a tip box. And a big red tip box with a padlock on it. At the end of the day, the boss would open up the tip box, and of course I was by far the youngest. The people who, by the way, inhabit or work for car washes, at least in those days, were mostly drifters. They'd come in for 2-3 days, a lot of alcohol, firearms, running the numbers, and that kind of thing. They wanted to split the tips among themselves and not cut me in. So I went to the boss, and he told me he wasn't going to cut me in, so I mouthed off at him until he fired me. So I walked up the street to a gas station and got a job there and worked there happily for the next 5 years or so. And you might say, well, what did I learn from that? I certainly learned you could get fired. But I also, I wasn't going to stay if it wasn't fair. So if he hadn't fired me, I probably would have quit.
Your dad was a doctor and former U.S. military veteran, and your mom's a teacher. How do they influence your career choices?
For my mother, she was picky about language, and this may sound small, but when you're in a leadership position, particularly the world's largest organization, that craves clarity and consistency, how you express yourself is really important. So I would think carefully what words I wanted to give my direction in, and then I'd repeat them again and again once I got them just right. From him, my father was intolerant of only one thing, and that was intolerance. He could come to judgment, he could come to action, but he had very wide ears. And here, again, later in life when I was Secretary of Defense, you're traveling around the world, you're talking to enemies, you're talking to friends, and in every case you're carrying the banner of the United States of America in the defense of our own people, but you got to listen before you know what to say.
And early in your career, you started off as a physicist and then transitioned into public policy. How hard was it to make that transition, and what was that process like?
In those days, it wasn't as hard as it has been recently, and there's a lesson there I'll come back to in a minute. But for me, the generation that taught me, I was an elementary particle physicist, so the big rings, accelerator rings, Fermi Lab, Brookhaven, and so forth. And the people who were the seniors in that field were the Manhattan Project generation. So it was second nature to them, first, that that technology had a relationship with government, in particular with national defense. And second, that if you created, and you had knowledge and you created technology, these guys created the nuclear weapon. They had a deep sense of responsibility. And so they would tell stories about that, and it became part of my, so to speak, upbringing in physics, that you had to pay back and you had to take responsibility. So at one point, a couple of them came to me and said, we need you to go to Washington for 1 year, work on a particular technical project, peak of the Cold War. And I did, and I thought, when I went, I didn't know anything about Washington. I said, and I realized that this is a really important problem, and I could make a contribution because nobody in the room understood how the thing worked, but me, because I was a physicist. So think about that. If you're a young person and you're making that you're doing something consequential, and your personal contribution is making it a difference, that's what everybody craves, right? And so there I was in my early 20s, and I thought this is a pretty meaningful thing, and I stuck with it. And there's a lesson in this, if I may say so today, because the generation that came after of technologists didn't have connections to government, and in fact, as the Snowden and other incidents exhibited, had some disdain or fear, and certainly didn't want to have anything to do with the government. I think that's unfortunate, and so as Secretary of Defense, I tried to build a bridge to those people. Said, look, let's try to meet each other halfway. because the country really does need to be defended. And I can't do that without the help of technologists. But I had to meet them halfway, and I did, and it was very, very successful. And of course, now the mood has changed a little bit in the country, and more people from the tech community are saying, yeah, I really do get it. I have a responsibility not just to make money or sell advertising. I have a responsibility to the community in which I live, and I think that's healthy.
Most people don't understand how many people the Pentagon employs, larger than the staffs of GE, Amazon, and some of the world's largest companies.
All combined.
So talk about that responsibility of managing and working with so many people and hiring and firing, what that's like, and some of the harder decisions you've made in the process.
So it is bigger than the five other largest U.S. employers combined. More real estate than the state of Pennsylvania. Does more R&D than Microsoft, Apple, and Google, again combined. World's largest enterprise, and altogether about 3 million people directly employed. That is, these are soldiers or civilians, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, or civilians, and then another 4 million or so who are contractors to the government, who are working directly for us. That's a lot of people, and then you add their family members and so forth, and you've got tens of millions of people. Largest healthcare company, largest enterprise in the U.S., meaning in the world, is ours. Largely a pediatric practice, as you might imagine, because our people are young and they have children. It's unlike the VA, which has old people, so it's a geriatric heavy practice. So in the course of 37 years of my own association and working in and around the Pentagon, I got in every corner of the place over almost 4 decades of time. And so what I do in the book is just take the reader as an executive and give them an executive guide to every corner. How does each of those corners of the place work? How do you spend that much money, $750 billion a year? How do you hire and fire with all those millions of people? What rules do you set from the top? And of course, the very important things, which are how do you conduct operations to destroy, defeat your enemies, deter them if possible. That's the heart of things, of course, but to do that you have to deal with presidents, you have to deal with foreign leaders, you have to go down the chain of command, you have to have a relationship with the troops and their families, a relationship not only of honor and trust, but caring, because you're putting them in risky situations. So it's a big responsibility, but if you think about it, there are a lot of important things in life, but making it so that people can wake up in the morning, hug their kids, send them off to school, go to work, live their lives, dream their dreams. You can only have that if you have security. If you have security, you don't think about it. If you don't, you think about nothing else. I always say security is like oxygen in that regard. And we provide that oxygen. And so it's a pretty important mission. It's a wonderful thing to wake up to in the morning. And that's a lot of responsibility, but it's a really noble thing to do. And I used to tell troops that all the time.
Can you talk about the workplace culture of the Pentagon, as well as your leadership style and what other organizations can learn from it?
The Pentagon, first of all, thrives on clarity and consistency. And I think people are like that in general, particularly large organizations. The military organization, as you might imagine, is particularly so. And what that means is that they'll largely do what they're told if they understand what it is that you are instructing. So I had to pick words very carefully, think very carefully. And remember, these are people who have been around a long time too. So if I were sitting next to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford, he's my age. He's been doing it since he was my age. And he knows a lot. And so I can benefit a lot. But at the end of the day, when you're the boss and you're in that kind of culture, and this is probably true almost anywhere, they're going to do what you say, and so you have to be very careful about it. So I would say clarity and consistency, and the other thing I'm big on is personal conduct, because I think you get the best out of people if they feel that you're a decent person and they feel that they're in an environment where everyone is being decent and is given an opportunity to do their best. And in the military, the profession of arms is about honor and trust. And if you can't trust people, and the belief that if you can't trust people in small things, you can't trust them in big things. You don't want somebody in the same foxhole or down the line who has shown themselves to be weak of character. So it matters a lot. I say that now, Dan, only because we see in public life things kind of accepted about sexual relations with subordinates, lying, things like that we don't allow in the military. And I was a stickler for good conduct because I thought it's inconsistent in general with a good place, but particularly with one that does something as solemn as protect us.
You're in the Pentagon, and part of your workforce is literally on the battlefield in other countries fighting for us. We talked about empathy before this. How do you empathize with them and connect with them, and tell everyone about how it's not just about them, but shaking hands with them as a way to support their families?
Everywhere I went, in every theater, every place where we had people deployed, I would have troop talks, and there would be hundreds of soldiers, sailor, air, marine, that there were all these young faces looking up at me. And I'd always tell them two things. The first is, why are you here? What's the meaning of this? What's the strategic good of it? Remember, these are people who are 18, 19 years old. They don't know international strategy. You have to explain it to them in a way that they can grasp, and a way that they can explain to their buddies, their girlfriends or boyfriends, and their parents back home. And the second thing I tell them is how noble their mission was, and how proud I was of them, and how proud the country was of them, and how proud they ought to be of themselves to be doing something that is bigger than themselves, and that is for everyone else. And they would understand that. And when I was talking to them, I wasn't only talking to them, I was talking to their families. And I would stand out in the 120 degrees in the desert in Afghanistan or Iraq and shake hands. First I'd see the leaders of the country and my commanders, and then I'd always see the troops. And I'd be shaking hundreds of hands and 120 degrees, and I would be doing it looking like I look right now, Dan, in a suit, a little flag on my lapel and a tie on, the whole deal. And my staff would say, Mr. Secretary, you don't need to do that. Let's take your jacket off. And the troops would say, hey, sir, it's just us. You can relax. And I never did. I always stayed looking just like this, and here's why. I thought that if I was expecting them to do what I needed them, behave in the way that I needed them to behave, then I ought to behave the way people sort of expect a Secretary of Defense to behave. And one way of signifying that is by looking the part. And every time I shook a hand, a picture would be taken. And we would give those pictures to the kids, and they'd send them home. And that picture is going to show up, it's going to get sent home to mom, it's going to show up on her bedside table or on the mantle. And she doesn't know who the Secretary of Defense is and doesn't care, but she wants her loved one in that picture to look like they're doing something really important. And there is the Secretary of Defense. You can tell the suit, can you see the flag? And I wanted to look, because I wanted that picture to be right for the whole family. I think little things like that in a big organization are big things, because they're keying off of your own behavior. So it's not only important that you have the right strategy, that you give the right orders, it's also important that you behave properly, because that signifies to them what kind of person you you are, and that motivates and validates what they're doing.
Yeah, the word conduct is probably the word I most associate with you. You've mentioned that's how you hire, that's part of why you fire, that's part of why you dress the way you do. This is the first time I've wore a tie, except for a wedding, in literally 2 years. So I wanted to follow your lead. Thank you. So just tell me more about your personal conduct and the impact you think that's made on your career.
It's rare to go through 37 years of uninterrupted government employment. I was not always in Washington, but I was always a close enough advisor that I was a special government employee, and I never was investigated for anything. Now, why is that? I mean, first of all, I never did anything, but secondly, I never even got close to doing anything. And there's so many ways that you can cut corners or seem to be cutting corners. And in public life, I think in life in general, but you can't have that kind of thing. In the profession of arms and in warfare and in leadership of something as serious as defense, I don't think you can have it either. So I was hard on myself. And there are little things like how the accounting is done. I'm out to dinner with somebody. For years and years, Dan, if you and I went out to dinner, we'd have to split the bill right down the middle. We'd have to account for everything. I couldn't accept your generosity, and I couldn't give you generosity. In fact, it was strange to me after I left office, first of all, to be able to walk by myself without a security guards around me. And second, to be able to go out to dinner with someone and say, who's going to pick this up? And it could be them or me, but we'd have to split it right down the middle. So I never cut corners, and I wanted to be known for that. And when people that I valued very highly, and I told a story in there of someone that I was one of the most talented people I ever had working for me, but he misbehaved. And I had to remove him from my office. That's incredibly important. I believe in every leadership position, but certainly in public life. Now, of course, we see all this other stuff going on now in Washington, kinds of things I've never seen in my professional life in terms of conduct, and I don't like it. I'll tell you frankly, I just don't approve of that kind of thing at all. I wouldn't condone it myself.
One of the big topics in the employment world right now is diversity, especially gender diversity. McKinsey just released a study that found that most women don't make it to senior leadership roles because they can't even make it to management. Plus there's the gender pay gap. It's just a huge topic. And one of the things that you did as Secretary of Defense was you allowed all women to enroll in the Army. Tell me why you did it, why you wanted to be the one to do it, and what impact you think that made in the Army.
Yeah, what I did was open up all military positions to women. There had been some that were considered, very male, close combat, that women were barred from. My reason for doing that, first and foremost, was we have an all-volunteer military. We don't have a draft. And so I compete with the rest of the economy for talent. So I need the best people who can meet our qualifications and do the mission best. And I can't afford to take half the population off the table when I am getting the best people. Now, that doesn't mean that men and women are the same in all respects. I mean, our studies clearly showed that when it came to loading artillery shells, for example, most men would do it better than most women most of the time. But there would be women who could do a lot better than some men. And then there are other things that women do, other kinds of skills, including ones that are very combat important in terms of command and control and so forth, that women in our studies do better. The point is, I want the most qualified person in every role. And now the numbers are quite small because the number of it turns out that women don't choose those specialties much. They do. A lot of them are intelligence officers, are logisticians, technologists, pilots, and other things. But even for those who don't choose those close combat roles of being an infantryman or a special forces person, if there's a part of the military that is closed to them, there's a sense in which they're second-class citizens. So even the majority of women who don't go into these positions are put at a disadvantage if we didn't open up those positions. So those were the reasons I did it. I had no doubts that it was the right thing to do. I had to do it in such a way. I did it very carefully. I did the announcement of it very carefully and made sure I had all the studies and analyses behind me so I could dominate anybody who wanted to question that decision, because if I had flubbed that, the issue would have been screwed up for a generation. Once you throw things into a political maelstrom, something that should be a professional talent management matter, not a political matter, if it gets politicized, then it's a mess for a long time. I obviously didn't want that to. As it happens, it went incredibly smoothly. Implementation has gone incredibly smoothly. And there are things you have to think about when you think about implementation, bathrooms and all sorts of stuff like that. So there are real issues there, but I thought that they were resolvable issues, and they have been resolved, and it's been very successful, but it was necessary to do.
You've made all sorts of major decisions in your career. Secretary of Defenses have always had to go up against terrorism and war, and now trade wars. So much can happen. How, judging by your personality, you seem like someone who's very confident. Of course, you're very educated. You have a lot of experience that led you, in the Defense Department for such a long period of time. You're very calm, cool, collected. Do you think that all lended to be able to just take a step back and come up with the best decision at the right time, even though you were under so much pressure?
I think those things helped. I was helped immeasurably in my being the top guy by the fact that I had been to number 2, I had been to number 3, so I had seen how things are done. Logic still matters a lot, and when I come to the conclusion that something is right for my country, the jaw is set, and you have to be strong in a role like this, because sometimes you're going to a foreign leader and you're wagging your finger in their face and you're saying, don't screw around with me or my country. And sometimes you're even going to friends and saying, I need you to do so and so. So there's a certain amount of, as Lyndon Johnson used to say, sometimes a little skin comes off with the hair. There's a little bit of toughness that needs to come with that. And I found that my sense of what had to be done to protect my people, if I had a strong logic for it, then it was easy for me to have the personality strength it takes to stare down other people, to send our own people into harm's way, and where necessary, destroy our enemies.
What is the responsibility and role of a leader during turbulent times? And what are the first few steps to being able to handle that and being able to connect with your different employees to make sure that they're confident that you have everything in control?
Yeah, when you enter into what I'll call a crisis situation, you're usually, if you have any sense, you don't really know what's going on. Therefore, you can't really know what you're supposed to do. But it's the worst thing in the world is not to say or do anything if you're the leader. So the question is, what do you do in a crisis when you don't know all the facts? And here's my advice. Don't be silent. If you're silent, the worst rumors will get going and you will seem feeble and indecisive. And that takes away the room that you need to do the right thing, whatever this crisis turns out to be. And so you need to say something. And in situations, one morning I woke up and we clearly had just bombed a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. And I knew I didn't know all the facts and so forth, but there it was on television, burning. And I knew I needed to say something since I didn't know everything that was going on. I said what I knew, which is, I just say a few facts. That will satisfy people that you are willing to speak, you're not trying to hide anything. Don't go out and tell them everything you don't know, because then you look foolish. Eventually you will know. You want to show some sense of confidence. So say what you know. Secondly, even though you don't understand the situation, you can't know what ultimate action you should take. Do something. Give your people instructions. They crave that because they need to know that everything's going to be okay and they'll play a role in it. And you can also tell the press, I have given the following instructions. And they can be quite elementary instructions, which will be sensible, whatever actually has happened, which of course you don't know fully. But it's important in the early hours to speak and act sensibly, but decisively. And I think that's the most, and then that'll buy you the time and the stature to figure out what the hell is going on and climb on top of it and manage it to a successful resolution.
It seems like you were best prepared for the role of Secretary of Defense because you were at the Pentagon for so long and you learned from so many different people there. Can you talk about some of your mentors at the Pentagon and what they taught you that helped you be prepared and successful in your job when you were the Secretary of Defense?
Yeah, not only had I been around for a long time and had been in all the different layers, but I was lucky in that a number of former Secretaries of Defense were mentors of me when I was a lot younger. One of them was Jim Schlesinger, who was Richard Nixon's Secretary of Defense, and then also was the CIA director and the very first Secretary of Energy. Great man. And he took an interest in this young physicist and sort of helped nudge me along. Another one was Brent Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor to President Ford and also to President Bush I. Another one was William Perry, who was Secretary of Defense to Bill Clinton, and so close to me that Bill stood in for my father at my wedding. Bob Gates, whom I knew from Summers and Aspen, who was, of course, my boss when I was the number 3 in the Pentagon. And these were great. I believe this country's been blessed with great Secretaries of Defense. I really think these are all formidable people, and I could keep going with the list. They were great people, and I learned a lot from them. They did a lot for me by literally giving me things to do that moved my career forward. I think they were doing that on the merits, but I'm grateful for it. But I also got to see what the Secretary of Defense was like. And you don't think you're ever going to be the Secretary of Defense. There's only one person at the very top. Why would it be you? But you could look at it and say, well, I can see how I could do that because I know Jim well enough and I've heard him talk about it and so forth. I think I could step into those shoes if I were ever given the opportunity. And I was very lucky in that regard. And so I had one form of very good preparation. I don't want to say it was better than everybody else's, because all these guys were talented before me. They did different things. I mean, Dick Cheney was in the Congress, was a member of Congress. That's a distinguished thing to do, gave him a different kind of experience, and so on and so forth. So they were all pretty good, except the first Secretary of Defense threw himself out of the 11th floor of a building. So I was the 25th Secretary of Defense. If I had been asked to be the second Secretary of Defense, I may have given it another thought, given the only precedent. But by number 25, it seemed like a reasonable thing to do.
And what's your best piece of career advice?
People ask me all the time, they say, I'm at a fork here, and I've narrowed it down to two choices, and what I really want to do is A, but if I do B, I don't really want to do it, but it'll lead to this, that, and the other thing, and they have this whole billiard shot, where finally, after bouncing off a number of cushions and going a long way, doing a bunch of things they don't want to do, they finally knock a ball in a pocket. And my advice is to ask yourself, when you wake up tomorrow morning, where would you rather be going to work? And that's not a self-indulgent thought. It is a logical, instrumental thought, because if you wake up tomorrow and do something that you really like, you'll do it well, and that will carry you forward. You'll excel at it. If you do something that you just think is the first link in a longer chain, but you don't want to do it, you'll do it poorly, and it won't lead anywhere. So I think it's both good emotional advice, but more importantly, it's good instrumental advice, and that's the important thing. That's what I did myself in my own life. That's the advice I'd give anybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ash.
Thanks.
Pleasure having you on the
Really
show.
appreciate it.